So guys, to continue talking about the different roles that nouns can perform in the sentence, now we can observe three more possibilities for these roles. We can find that a noun can be an indirect object, it can be an object complement, it can be an appositive as well. We are familiar with the concept of an indirect object and an object complement from last lesson. We know that to have an indirect object, we need by force to have a direct object. We understand that the indirect object receives the action of the direct object. We know that to classify an indirect object, we need to have a pattern that places the indirect object before the direct object. And there are different questions that must be answered by an indirect object. To find an indirect object, as you know, you need to answer the questions to what, for what, to whom, or for whom. Now, you need to bear in mind that there are a specific set of verbs that allow this possibility of an indirect object. Not every transitive verb allows this. Actually, to be technical, the verbs that allow us to have an indirect object and a direct object is what we call a detransitive verb. D-I-T-R-A-N-S-T-I-V-E. Detransitive. Let me show you an example of a sentence that exhibits an indirect object. Okay, check this sentence. Ruth sent her little niece a Kit Kat bar. Remember that the first thing we need to do is, you got it, the first thing we need to do is to identify the nouns, not to assign roles. Remember, I repeat, if you start assigning roles from the get-go, from the beginning, you are going to end up classifying things that may have the functions which you assign. In other words, something may be a subject, something may be a direct object, but it's very likely that that something that you are classifying is not going to be a noun. So, first thing we do is to identify the nouns. Let's check it out. Ruth is a noun, of course, it's a proper noun. Niece is a noun. You may have nieces or not, but anyway, you can pluralize the word. Kit Kat is a noun. It's even capitalized. Although we have to be careful. Allow me to make a short parenthesis here. We have to be careful because a word may be capitalized but not necessarily be a noun. I'm not going to explain much on this because I don't want you to get confused, but I need you to understand that some nouns, let me rephrase that. Some words may be capitalized but not be nouns. I will try not to include those, but it happens. For example, nationalities. As you know, nationalities, Salvadorian, Italian, Chinese, Guatemalan, they are written with a capital G, but they are not nouns. They are what we call proper adjectives, and proper adjectives are also written with an initial capital letter. But it's a clue that allows us to decide that something is a noun. I repeat, not in every case. There are adjectives that are written with capital letter, with initial capital letter. Now, Kit Kat, it's a noun. You have maybe eaten Kit Kat chocolates. And bar is also a noun. Now, to identify the role of Ruth, I can simply say who did the action, who sent something. Ruth did. So I know that Ruth is the subject of this sentence. Sent her little niece a Kit Kat bar. Now, here we have the verb send. Send is a transitive verb. How do I know it's a transitive verb? Because if I ask, Can you send something? Can you send someone? And if you have a positive answer, that means that that verb is a transitive verb. Now, Ruth sent who or Ruth sent what? If I say Ruth sent who, I can say, oh, she sent her little niece. Direct object. Not really. Because remember that Ruth, you gotta remember one of the most important things that we need to do when we are performing sentence analysis is to understand the sentence. If we do not understand the sentence, then we cannot do the analysis properly. Now, I know that Ruth is doing the action of sending, but she is not sending a person in this case. She is sending something. She is sending a Kit Kat bar, right? So I say, Ruth sent what? A Kit Kat bar. Now, I cannot classify both nouns as the direct object. Only the central noun of that phrase is going to be the direct object. Now, is it Kit Kat or is it bar? I'll give you a second to think about it. The direct object is bar, because Kit Kat is a noun that is acting as an adjectival. Yes, so I say Kit Kat, adjectival, and bar, direct object. And then what is niece? Niece is the indirect object. Let's test it. Ruth sent a Kit Kat bar. To whom did she send the bar? To her little niece. So the word niece is the indirect object. Well, that's the case of indirect objects. Now, let's go back to the presentation. Here we go. Next, we have the case of object complements. Remember, again, an object complement can only occur with a direct object. And in this case, we find the opposite in terms of order. In the case of an indirect object, the indirect object precedes the direct object. But in the case of the object complement, we will find the object complement after the direct object. To find an object complement, we need to have a special verb. Remember that in your book you have a short list of verbs that allow us to have object complements, right? Now, an object complement complements the idea of the direct object. So, it's going to rename the direct object, or it's going to describe the direct object. Just like the case of the subject complement. But remember that the subject complement renames, the subject complement describes the subject. Yes, but you can see the relation, right? We have a subject complement and an object complement. Both rename, both describe, but they describe different things. A subject complement, either a predicate nominative or a predicate adjective, renames the subject, and an object complement is going to rename the direct object. Now, to find an object complement, you need a verb, a specific kind of verb. There are not many verbs that allow us to have object complement. If you have checked the list, where you will find verbs like select, choose, make, appoint, consider, think, paint, even color. So you can find different verbs over there that allow us to have object complements. Let me write an example for you. Okay, I have gone ahead and underlined the nouns in this sentence. Let me read it for you. The kids at school considered Mr. Parker a wussy, but actually he was a Spider-Man. Hey, Mr. Parker. Now, again, I have insisted, and I do it again. Do not start assigning roles the minute you start looking at the sentence. First, understand the sentence and then move on to underline the nouns. Only after you have done that, please go ahead and start assigning roles for nouns. Why? Because check out this he. What is he? It's the subject. It's the subject of the clause. But he is not a noun. So we are not classifying pronouns. Right now we are only working with nouns. Now, what is a wussy? In case you're wondering, it's over there. Wussy is a coward, a weakling. Kids is the subject of the sentence. School is the object of the preposition at. Then we have the verb consider. Consider allows us to have an object complement. Remember that an object complement is going to be located after the direct object and it's going to be renaming it. Now, the kids at school considered who? They considered Mr. Parker. Mr. Parker in this case is the direct object. Who is the wussy? For those kids at school, who is a wussy? Mr. Parker. And who is Mr. Parker? It's a wussy. It is renaming Mr. Parker. So, wussy is actually an object complement. Remember that to find the object complement, you need to ask the question, what, after the direct object. You gotta be careful with this. Not after the verb. After the verb, you ask the question, what, you are going to find the direct object. If you ask the question, what, after the direct object, and you get an answer, that is an object complement. They considered Mr. Parker what? A wussy. And then, moving on with the sentence, but actually he was Spider-Man. What is Spider-Man? Spider-Man is a predicate nominative. And that's the case of object complements. Moving on with the presentation, next we are faced with appositives. An appositive is a noun that also renames, just like an object complement, just like a predicate nominative, an appositive renames. And now, you may be getting confused by now, like saying, oh man, so many things are renaming. Yes, we have many things that rename, but they rename different things. A subject complement, or a predicate nominative to be more precise, renames the subject. Only the subject. And to find the predicate nominative, you need to find verb to be. And it takes the position after the verb. After asking the question, what, after the verb, after the linking verb, should you get an answer, then you say that you have a predicate nominative. But to have an object complement that is also renaming, see, an object complement also renames, but an object complement renames only a direct object. Well, not really. I have discussed with some of you why it's not renaming only direct objects, but I'm not going to discuss this because, well, we are already not seeing one another. You cannot be asking questions at this moment. So if I explain this right now, it's going to be more problematic. So, but you can see that to have an object complement, you need a special verb. You need a special verb. You need to ask the question, what, after the direct object, right? And if you don't have a special verb and you cannot answer the question, what, after the direct object, you cannot have an object complement. An appositive is a noun that renames another noun. It's a noun that is in apposition with another noun. But an appositive is in apposition to any noun. It can be an appositive for a subject. It can be an appositive for a direct object. It can be an appositive for an object complement even, theoretically speaking, of course. I have to stop right now, but in the next video, I will briefly explain to you the difference between a predicate nominative, an object complement, and a appositive. Cool.